For centuries, Jews have ended their Passover celebrations with the phrase, "next year in Jerusalem." 40 years ago today, that prayer was finally answered. On June 7, 1967, Israeli forces stood at the walls of Jerusalem, ready to take over the city for the first time in almost 2,500 years. June 7th, just 2 days into the war, Israel had already pushed deep into Egypt, pushed Jordan out of much of the West Bank, and pummeled Syria with artillery fire. Now on day 3, Israel's leaders were poised to do the unthinkable, to recapture Jerusalem and bring the city under Jewish control for the first time in nearly 2,500 years. One day earlier, Israel's 55th Paratrooper Brigade had fought its way to the walls of Jerusalem's old city. Now at sunrise on June 7th, Israel's military command ordered the paratroopers to take the city. They advanced through the Lion's Gate and encountered fierce house-to-house combat along the way. That morning, soldiers reached the western wall of the Temple Mount, the holiest place in Judaism. In nearly 20 years of Jordanian rule, no Jew had been allowed in the area. Military leaders Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin arrived at the wall, where many of the paratroopers wept for their fallen comrades. Rabbi Shlomo Goren blew the shofar, and Israel reclaimed its heritage in the ancient city. It was one of the most joyful moments in Jewish history. General Moshe Dayan later ruled that Muslims could keep control of the Temple Mount, the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. His decision angered many Jews who had been denied access to their holy places for so long. On the Sinai Peninsula, Israel surrounded the Egyptian army, and the rout of Egypt was well underway. In fact, Egypt's retreat was so chaotic that Israel's advance was slowed by stalled Egyptian vehicles. The same day, Israel's navy reached Sharm el-Sheikh to reopen the strategic Straits of Tiran. In the West Bank, Israel's military victories forced Jordan to declare a ceasefire and withdraw completely from the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria. Israel now had control of cities rooted in Jewish history, such as Hebron, Jericho, and Bethlehem. Well, the Israelis have controlled Jerusalem for the past 40 years. 40 years, you know, is a biblical generation. But the battle over the future of the Holy City is far from over. In fact, the battle for Jerusalem may just have begun. Chris Mitchell has that story.
In Hebrew, the city is called Yerushalayim, and for more than 3,000 years, it has stood as the centerpiece of Jewish hopes and dreams. Dory Gold is the best-selling author of the book, The Fight for Jerusalem.
The memory of Jerusalem comes up in the wedding ceremony and the circumcision, virtually in all the rites of passing of the Jewish faith, so that when Jews heard on June 7th, 1967, that Jerusalem had been recaptured and now was being reunited, it unleashed an enormous sense of historical longing among the Jewish people worldwide.
Katja Kahaner was a deputy battalion commander, one of the first soldiers to reach the Lion's Gate of the old city.
I cannot forget the feeling in my fingers straight to my heart when I touched the stones of the wall of the old city of Jerusalem. And I carry it with me till today.
Eli Adid was 24 years old when he fought to take back the old city.
It's very emotional. Almost every year I go to a memorial of my friends who fell. And every time we meet, we're excited and emotional once again.
This is the Lion's Gate, where 40 years ago the Israeli soldiers broke through to recapture the city. Today, there's a new battle raging for Jerusalem, but it's not being fought with soldiers and tanks.
For most Arab Muslims, the loss of Jerusalem was a tragedy. And when they lost on the battlefield, they turned to a diplomatic and media war, one in which they were more successful. 40 years after the '67 war, not one nation has its embassy in Jerusalem, Israel's capital. And current peace plans, like the Saudi plan advanced this year, call for the redividing of Jerusalem along the lines before 1967. Saudi plan has support in Washington and in Europe. But Dori Gold warns that redividing the city would fuel jihadist flames in Israel and around the world.
When people come to Jerusalem today, from the U.S. Department of State, from the British Foreign Office, and say, accept the Saudi plan, which divides Jerusalem, they think that they are stabilizing the Middle East, but they're actually unleashing new forces that they have no idea of.
The current contention for Jerusalem is not just between Jews and Muslims. Jews themselves are divided about the decision by Moshe Dayan in 1967 to leave the Temple Mount in Muslim hands. Shlomo Gazit was director of military intelligence during the '67 war. He says Dayan was wary of taking charge of a Muslim holy site.
He wanted to minimize the implications of our military occupation. And no provocation unless totally necessary, and to have a military and Israeli flag on the Temple Mount is a provocation.
But for others like Chaim Richman, it was a betrayal for Israeli leaders to leave the Temple Mount in the possession of their sworn enemies.
It's basically a high treason, in my mind, to take that which is the holiest to the Jewish people and allow it to be overrun by those that are the sworn enemies of the Jewish people and those who embark upon a campaign to destroy the vestige of Jewish presence from that people and steal the legacy of the Jewish people from the world and say that the whole thing never happened. It's a serious situation, and it shows a profound spiritual bankruptcy.
Today, some Israeli Arabs, such as Sheikh Ra'id Salah, demand that Muslims take back Jerusalem by force if necessary. But most Israeli leaders promise to keep Jerusalem undivided and under the flag of Israel.
I think the vast majority of Israelis want to keep Jerusalem united under the rule of Israel because they understand that turning over the old city of Jerusalem to Palestinian Hamas is virtually the same as turning it over to the Taliban.
Since 1967, the secular West has grown more hostile to the idea of Jerusalem as a united city under Israel's control, as it was in Bible times. Gold warns there is danger in dismissing the biblical roots of Judeo-Christian culture.
If the West says Jerusalem unimportant, just a bunch of stones, then they're giving up something which has been at the center of the belief system of their fathers and grandfathers for decades and centuries. And that is a horrible mistake.
In my estimation, the 7th of June, 1967, marks one of the greatest turning points in divine history.
Bible scholar Lance Lambert says that in light of prophecy, Israel's retaking of Jerusalem was a major event.
40 years is generally accepted as a biblical generation. We have had 40 years, and Jerusalem is still in the hands of the Jewish people. Now, there's going to be enormous battles and conflict and strife over this, and the prophet Zechariah says it. He says all nations will come against Jerusalem. We shall see what that means.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world